Hello and welcome to our January town hall meeting. This month we're featuring a topic that really has a big impact on those of us involved in jail and prison ministry around the United States, and that is the issue of religious liberty. And to help us today, we have panelists, three people. We have Dan Balserak. He's the Director of Religious Liberty and the Assistant General Counsel for the USCCB in Washington. And as the Director of Religious Liberty, Dan leads the policy and advocacy work of the USCCB in matters of religious liberty. He provides legal advice to the Bishops' Conference. He joined the Bishops' Conference in 2020 after 2 years in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the Office of Civil Rights, where he was the Chief of Policy Information for the office's Conscience and Religious Freedom Division. He's also served as in-house counsel for the Archdiocese of Washington, and also worked as an associate at Sullivan and Worcester in my hometown of Boston. He has a degree in philosophy at Dartmouth College, studied law at University of Virginia, and he lives now in Washington, D.C. with his wife and his children. We also welcome Adèle Keim. Adèle, before she became a lawyer, she worked for a Canadian member of parliament and spent 2 years covering international religious freedom and social issues for the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada. She joined Becket Law, a public interest law firm, as a legal counsel in 2012. And while at Becket, Adèle has defended the rights of rock bands, Native American sacred dancers, organizations supporting Cuban orphanages, and nuns. And her first case as a lawyer was litigation in support of deaf inmates who were seeking resources to practice their religion in prison in Virginia. And also we welcome Eric Treene. Eric is the senior counsel at Storzer and Associates in Washington, D.C. He's an adjunct professor at Catholic University of the American School of Canon Law. He served 19 years in 4 administrations in the U.S. Department of Justice as special counsel for religious discrimination, where he provided leadership for the department on a wide range of religious liberty issues. And prior to serving at the Department of Justice, Mr. Treene was a litigation director at the Becket Fund in Washington and was a law clerk for the Honorable John Walker on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. He's a graduate of Amherst College and Harvard Law School. So welcome to you all, and thank you very much for joining us today and lending your expertise in this really important topic that it has a big effect on all of our work in correctional ministry. So perhaps Adèle, would you like to start us out?
I'll let my colleague Dan begin with an introduction to religious liberty and Catholic thought.
Sure. Thank you, Father. No one knows how to pronounce my name. I'm happy to just be called Dan. So the USCCB has advocated for religious freedom rights of incarcerated people when that issue has come up before the Supreme Court. And that is to say, in a context somewhat distant from the daily ministry that you all do on the ground in prisons. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity to express my gratitude to you for your work and to hopefully be of some more direct help to you. The Church holds that religious freedom is a fundamental human right. Dignitatis Humanae teaches that religious freedom has its foundation in the very dignity of the human person, as this dignity is known through the revealed word of God and by reason itself. And under the U.S. Constitution and United States federal statutes, religious freedom includes not only the right to hold religious beliefs, but the right to practice those beliefs. And that's not an absolute right in terms of conduct, but it is a strong right. I'm a lawyer by training, not a theologian, but it seems useful to me to think of church teaching on religious freedom as consisting of 2 main strands. First is immunity from coercion in religious matters. Individuals and religious entities must not be coerced to violate their beliefs. Of course, prison is a highly coercive environment. Short of the administration of the death penalty, imprisonment is the most coercive action that the state can take against an individual. People lose many rights to autonomy in prison. But the right to religious freedom is not one of them. Religious freedom is a limit on the coercive power of the prison system. It carves out a space for autonomy within this highly coercive environment. Now, freedom from coercion is a negative right, the right to not be forced to do something. The second strand of Catholic teaching on religious freedom is about positive obligations and duties. Reciprocal to immunity from coercion is the responsibility we have as individuals to seek the truth about God and to live in accordance with that truth. But this responsibility also falls on the state. The state has the duty to take positive steps to create conditions favorable to the fostering of religious life. And the flourishing of religion under those conditions ultimately redounds to the benefit of the broader community. We typically think of how this obligation of the state applies to free society, how to ensure that religious individuals or communities can participate fully in the public square without sacrificing or diminishing their religious character or beliefs. But prisons are, in a sense, societies of their own, self-contained societies with their own governance and their own rules. From the standpoint of Catholic social teaching, then, the obligation to create conditions necessary for the flourishing of religious life therefore applies with no less force to the governance of prisons. And one can easily see how a prison system, or how a prison where religious belief and exercise are allowed to flourish, would be to the benefit not only of individual inmates, but also to those communities. Properly understood, religious freedom protections under federal law, both constitutional and statutory, have much in common with church teaching on religious freedom. And those legal protections explicitly extend to inmates. And I'll turn it over to Adèle to explain what those protections are and how they work.
Good afternoon. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Adèle Keim. I'm senior counsel with the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty. We're a nonprofit law firm based in Washington, D.C., but working across the country to defend the fundamental right of religious freedom for people of all faiths. As Father George mentioned, I've represented everybody from Native American feather dancers to rock bands, and more than my fair share of nuns along the way and through the years. We're going to talk about some of the specific legal protections that people who are incarcerated have in this country for religious liberty. About 2 decades ago, Congress found something that you all know from your daily work. Prison bureaucrats often trample on religious liberty. It took Congress years of hearings to come to this conclusion. But when they did, Senator Hatch and Senator Kennedy, as he then was, issued a joint statement saying, whether from indifference, bigotry, or lack of resources, some institutions restrict religious liberty in egregious and unnecessary ways. You all know that already. But in response to many, many displays of religious suppression over a long period of years, an overwhelmingly bipartisan Congress passed a landmark civil rights statute that applies to virtually all the inmates that you all work with on a day-to-day basis. It was signed by President Clinton in 2000, and it's called the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Person Act. Don't write that down. Put your pens down. You can just call it RLUIPA. There'll be a link in the show notes to Becket's rundown of RLUIPA and how it applied in one recent Supreme Court decision. So you can feel free to take notes, or if you're an auditory learner, just sit back and listen. Let the legalese flow over you as we take our tour through this truly important statute. RLUIPA embodies a very simple principle. Prison officials should not impose egregious and unnecessary restrictions on religious liberty. Of course they do. Many prisoners lose many of their physical rights when they enter prison, as Dan just spoke of, but they cannot be forced to surrender peaceful expressions of their humanity due to the arbitrary whims of prison officials. just as the Constitution prevents dehumanizing forms of cruel and unusual punishment, our LUPA prevents stubborn bureaucrats from stripping inmates of their human dignity by denying them the ability to seek God. The social science shows that inmates who are allowed to practice their faith in prison have much lower rates of recidivism. There are benefits across the board. And of course, you all see that in your work day to day. That's why you're doing it. You believe in it. And I'm here to say that the law supports you in your work. Let me explain to you concretely how RFRA works so that you have an understanding of how in the next part of the presentation, when Eric Treene is going to talk to you about how to actually bring a claim under our LUPA, you have a sense of the framework that these things are litigated under. Our LUPA is a law that allows any person who is incarcerated in state or with an analogous law, federal prison, to bring a claim and to challenge a policy or practice that presents a substantial burden on their sincere religious beliefs. Our LUPA, you can think of our LUPA as a tennis match. In order to start off the tennis match, the person, the inmate, has to get the ball over the net. And then the government has the opportunity to hit the ball back. And the court determines if the government can't hit the ball back, then the court determines the inmate wins. So let me talk to you about what the inmate needs to do to get his or her ball over the net and start a valid and successful our LUPA claim. Our LUPA says that a person who can show that there is a substantial burden on their sincere religious exercise has shown a claim. And then the government, that's the ball getting across the net. And we'll go over all this again, but I'm just going to say substantial burden is the first step. The inmate has to show that there's a substantial burden on a sincere exercise of religion. Then the ball goes back across the net, and the government has the opportunity to say, hey, look, we have burdened their religious freedom, but we've done so in pursuing a compelling governmental interest, just one of our most compelling interests of the highest order. And we have no alternative. There's no workaround but to deny this person the ability to practice their faith in this situation. And then the court, if they succeed on their side, then the court will rule for the government. But if they don't succeed, and let me tell you a secret, it's really hard for them to succeed on that. It's a very, very high standard for them, for the government to meet. Then they are legally required by court order to accommodate the religious exercise that the prisoner is seeking to engage in. Okay, I promised you, once I told you this structure, the substantial burden, compelling interest, back and forth, I would go back through it and give you some details to put some flesh on the bones. Okay, substantial burden on a sincere religious practice. Sincere is number one. An inmate who's trying to vindicate a right under our LUPA, the first thing they need to show is that they are sincere. This is not a pretext for something else. They are genuine in their religious belief. They can show that all sorts of ways. They can show it by a pattern in practice. They can say, hey, I was a cradle Catholic. I have been taking Mass. My parents brought me to Mass when I was a kid, and I have rediscovered my faith in prison, and I have been attending services. Any evidence of their own sincere practice. They could say, they might be new to the Catholic faith. They might say, hey, you know what? I was never Catholic. I was raised Baptist, but once I got in prison, I realized I need to turn my life around, and I started going to Mass, and that has just changed my life. So evidence of sincerity. They have to show that it's not pretext. They sincerely believe this. The second thing they have to show is that it's religious. Not difficult if you're talking about a practicing Catholic. The Catholic faith is well established as a religious belief. Where LUPA does not, other laws might protect sort of individual conscientious objection that you might think of from like the military context and the avoidance of the draft. Those laws might protect philosophical objections, but our LUPA really protects religious beliefs. And Eric Treene has just put in the show notes, the Federal Bureau of Prisons has a whole manual on different religious beliefs and practices. And that's a really useful resource when you're helping prisoners bring one of these claims. They can point to bureaucratic document like this and say, look, other prison systems recognize that my beliefs are actually religious. They're not just philosophical, and they're not idiosyncratic. The law protects idiosyncratic religious beliefs, but if you come up with a religious belief that you need access to chocolate pudding every single meal, and double portion on Christmas, they're going to question step one, which is whether you're sincerely following a religious belief or whether you might have some other mixed motives in there for asserting this particular kind of religious belief. So anything that you can do to show a connection to external sources that validate, hey, this is something that Catholics regularly engage in. I will say, as someone who represents people of all religious faiths, Catholics are in luck because the Catholic Church has done such an exceptional job of making publicly available sources like the Catechism of the Catholic Church, all the statements from the USCCB, all the encyclicals. There are a lot of publicly available resources that Catholics can point to and that you as prison ministers can help provide to inmates that you're working with who are bringing claims like this to validate and substantiate the religious practices. Now, I want to put an asterisk here. One thing that started happening after the Arlupa and its sister-in-law RFRA were passed was prison officials started to saying things like, well, yeah, you're Catholic, and we know that a lot of Catholics like to pray the rosary, but it's not required. You can't show me that you think you're going to go to hell if you don't pray the rosary. You have permission to not pray the rosary. So we don't think that you have protection for a claim about being able to keep your rosary beads with you in your cell. And there are real claims about that. So Congress actually became aware of this problem and changed the law to say the religious practice does not have to be central to the religious belief. You don't have to show that if you don't pray those rosary beads every day, you will be damned to hell. You just have to show that it is a sincere religious practice in accordance with your Catholic faith. So devotional practices that are optional also receive protection under RFRA and Arlupa. And don't let anyone tell you otherwise, because prisons will sometimes still raise that as a kind of a counter argument when they're going back and forth with prisoners about whether they need to accommodate them. Okay, so the religious belief, it has to be sincere, it has to be religious, and it has to be burdened. In other words, the prisoner has to identify how they're being blocked from carrying out this religious practice. The burden must be imposed by the government. So if you say, look, there's another group of inmates that's stopping me from engaging in the religious practice that I want to engage in, unless that group of inmates is acting at the direction of prison officials, you're kind of out of luck. You could make an argument like the prison is not protecting me from this other group of inmates, but you really want to look at what is the prison policy that is stopping me from practicing my faith. The prisons will even say, and judges don't really love hearing like, this guard was mean to me, because the prison will say, well, that guard wasn't doing what we told him to do. That guard was just being a jerk, and maybe not even following our own practices. So you want to show that it's the government that's imposing this, and the more you can connect it to a written policy, the more successful it will be. It's not to say you can't be successful by arguing that a guard was bullying you or unreasonably depriving you of the ability to practice your faith, but the cleaner and faster you'll be able to litigate your case, or at least get resolution within the prison system, is to be able to connect it with an official policy. Okay, so that's the piece that the prisoner needs to show: sincere religious belief that is burdened by a government action. That means their tennis ball has made it over the net. Now, what does the government need to show? The government needs to be able to point to, in order to maintain its policy, which of course bureaucrats always want to maintain their policy. In order to maintain their policy, the government has to, in order to return the serve, the government has to show that it is pursuing a compelling interest, and that it has no workaround, no less restrictive alternative. Okay, we'll take that in two parts. Compelling interest. What's a compelling interest? Staffing is not a compelling interest. Following written policy is not a compelling interest. Safety and security can be compelling interests. And if the prison is smart, they'll relate their staffing concerns to safety and security. But it says so. And if I make an exception for you, I have to make an exception for everyone. So no exceptions, not a compelling interest. In fact, the Supreme Court has specifically rejected that as a compelling interest. Most of the time, the compelling interest that you hear in the prison context, or at least I hear in my practice, is security. And that sounds pretty convincing, right? Who's going to second guess the prison officials on security? They've got a hard job. They're keeping a lot of people in line. There are a lot of threats to security. I guess we should just pack up and go home. These inmates are going to lose. Wrong answer. Why? Well, a couple of reasons, but the first reason is less restrictive alternative. They can say security all day long, but if they have to also meet the second step of showing there's no way to advance their security interests and exempt your client, or sorry, not you guys, not clients, but exempt the person you're accompanying, or the person who's making the complaint. So like, let me give you an example of this in practice. There is a long-running case in Arkansas. It's been up to the Supreme Court once. This Muslim inmate in Arkansas, it went up to the Supreme Court 1990. Arkansas State Prison decided to keep jerking him around, and he won at the Supreme Court on a beard issue, a religious beard. But he and other Muslim inmates want to be able to wear religiously required headgear. The prison has said no, because if you wear a kufi, religiously required headgear, many Muslims, observant Muslims, men will wear this. It presents a security threat because you could store contraband there. Okay. Oh, wow. Well, I guess we should just give up and go home. No, you should not give up and go home, because what Mr. Muhammad and his fellow Muslim inmates did was they looked around them and they said, you know, we're not the only ones in this prison who want to wear hats. In fact, a lot of people in this prison wear hats, and there's no problem with them wearing hats because all of the work details go out with hats on in the wintertime. And sometimes the work details go out with, you know, baseball caps on in the summertime. So prison, you tell us that you're advancing your compelling interest in safety and security because there's a worry about contraband in hats, but you yourselves have a gaping hole in your no hats policy when it comes to work teams going to work outside and needing hats for the weather. So if you've figured out a way to accommodate, to continue to pursue your safety and security interests while allowing guys to wear hats when it's cold or baseball caps when it's hot, then you can make the same accommodations for us and allow us to wear our kufis for religious reasons. You have to treat us at least as well as you're treating those guys. Finding an exception like that actually allows you to beat the government in two different ways. If you find an exception, you can both show that they are not treating their security interest as an interest of the highest order. They're allowing other exceptions to it. So it shows that interest might not be as compelling as they're trying to tell the court it is. And the second way that it can help is directly on the less restrictive alternatives prong of the analysis. In other words, you have found a way to work around inmates who need hats to keep them warm in the winter or cool in the summer. That means that you can find a way to work around for us. So as a practical matter, your eyes and ears on the ground to help point out to the inmate, you know what, actually, the prison has accommodated a lot of other people who want something similar or whose activities undermine their security interests in almost the same way. That allows you to defeat the government's efforts to return the tennis ball over the net in two different ways. I will tell you one superpower that you all have because you have joined together and because you're sharing information across prison systems and across state lines. And that is this. In this Holt v. Hobbs case out of Arkansas that I was telling you about, that went up to the Supreme Court ruled 9-0 that Arkansas could not continue to maintain its security interests, that compelling interest in security, no beards because of security reasons. When Mr. Muhammad had shown that 41 other prison systems, including and the Federal Bureau of Prisons, all had policies that allowed inmates to wear religious beards. The court said where the policies of other well-run penal institutions allow this religious exercise without undermining the same interests in security and order that the prison system has maintained here, then your prison system that you're in has to distinguish themselves from all 40 other systems in the BOP and explain why not. Why are you so special that you can't run your prison while allowing a 1/4-inch beard to be worn by a few of your inmates for religious reasons? And because you have joined hands and you are in an information sharing posture, you have the ability to gather that information and to share it when you're in conversation with prison officials and say, look, the BOP, which the link is in the notes from Eric Treene, the BOP allows this religious observance. They don't give prisoners a hassle about bringing communion wine in or whatever practice it is. And look at all of the neighboring states around you that you go to your conferences with. They're all allowing this to happen, and you have those policies and practices because of your information sharing in this network. You know that if you were ever to get into court on this, you wouldn't have a leg to stand on, because the courts who normally don't want to second guess a prison official's determination about safety and security. But if they hear that all of the other prison systems and states around you have found a way to do this without threatening their own interests in safety and security, they're going to ask you to do a better job of explaining yourself. So just to sum up, prisoners do not lose their religious liberty when they go to prison. And Congress recognized that prison systems struggle with that concept and will often put unnecessary barriers in the way of religious practice in prison. So they created a law that is specifically directed at allowing inmates to vindicate their religious freedom in prison. And it's a tennis match. And in order to get the ball over the net, the prisoner has to show that they have a sincere religious belief that is burdened by a government action. Then that gets the ball over the net, and the government has to show that they have a compelling interest in pursuing this policy, and no less restrictive alternative. There's no workaround. They have to pursue this policy with respect to this particular inmate. They cannot make a single exception for this inmate. That's a very high standard to meet. And particularly, it's a really high standard to meet if the prison has done one of two things, which they almost always have. And that is, number one, allowed exceptions to their policy for other reasons, like, the hat example, or have allowed, or if other prisons have figured out a way to accommodate this religious practice, which again, in many cases, other prison systems have found a way to accommodate it. If you can find those two things, you can make it almost impossible, not almost, don't let me overstate, prisons are very creative. You can make it very, very difficult for the prison system to meet its burden, and you can help the inmates that you're accompanying continue to exercise their beliefs. And when one inmate wins that, it sends a message to the whole prison system that they need to do more, work harder to accommodate. So it can have a network effect. When even just one inmate is successful in their claim, it can help create a better climate in the prison for all of the inmates that you all are walking besides. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, very much. It's really super helpful. Thank you. And I just want to remind our people joining us that if you have comments or questions for the panelists, please put them in your chat feature. But before we get to the questions, I wanted to give Dan and Eric a chance to kind of give their input into the conversation.
Yes, well, thank you. So a few points, maybe to answer one of the questions, which I think is a good segue into what I was going to talk about, which is, what do you do if there are uneven privileges for religious services? So you might be allowed to meet, but maybe another group is allowed to meet more frequently or more easily without as much bureaucracy. It's important to remember that RLUIPA covers substantial burdens on religion, not just burdens. So you might have a situation where you can have only eight books in your cell, and someone might want to have more religious books. They'd have to show that they really need 10 or 12 or more, that's a substantial burden on their religion, not just an inconvenience, a mild burden. As Adèle said, it doesn't have to be central. It doesn't have to be a sin not to do it, but it has to have some degree of substantiality. And that sometimes with discrimination presents a problem. There might be something where you say, hey, we'd like to meet 3 times a week, and this other group, the Black Muslim group's meeting 3 times a week. Maybe for security reasons, they're allowing that, right? Because they're worried about them or whatever, or they complain the loudest. We want to be treated equally, and they say no. And, show us how this substantially burdens you. Well, there's actually another remedy. RLUIPA is one federal law that protects you, and it says you can't substantially burden someone's religious exercise without a compelling government interest. But there are various statutes in the Constitution that say you can't discriminate among religions. And in particular, what I want to talk about is how you can get the Department of Justice to help you in these matters, both under RLUIPA and in these other discriminatory situations. The special litigation section of DOJ, which we put in the box there, has a RLUIPA practice where they will bring cases to vindicate prisoners' rights in state prisons. Now, it doesn't cover Bureau of Prisons. So if you're in the federal system, you can contact DOJ, and sometimes they'll communicate with the Bureau of Prisons, but you really need to go directly to the Bureau of Prisons. I found the chaplain's office there, the chief of chaplains, in Washington to be very helpful in trying to reach accommodations where they can. Sometimes Main Justice, DOJ can put some pressure on BOP, which is a component of DOJ. But when you're dealing with state prisons and local jails, DOJ, Civil Rights Division, Special Litigation Section will actually investigate and bring cases. There's a woman there who coordinates it. Her name's Dina Fox. I don't want to give out her email without her permission, but if you want to email me, I'll put my email in the box, which is Treene, ETREENE @gmail.com, and I'll do it right now as we're talking. Treene@gmail.com. If you reach out to me, I can put you in touch with her. She has every 2 months a meeting with advocates, and I'm on that call. And there's Muslim groups, a lot of Jewish groups, not so much in the Christian side, and no one from the Catholic side that I know of, but they really like to hear what's going on where there are cases. So they can help with RLUIPA cases. The DOJ can also help with discrimination cases. There's another part of DOJ called the Office of Justice Program, and they have an Office of Civil Rights within the Office of Justice Programs. And the idea is they give out money to various states under the Safe Streets Act and other acts, and there's a condition on that money, which is that you can't discriminate. So if there is discrimination going on, they will investigate individual claims. Now, it gets complicated here because Dina Fox in the Special Litigation Section, if there's a pattern or practice, like if you have a whole system that's discriminating against Jews or Catholics or Muslims, they can bring an action under a different law, the CRIPA, the Civil Rights of Institutionalized Persons Act. So it's worth notifying them, but for individual cases, they will be referring them over to the Office of Justice Programs, who look at individual cases, try to resolve them, or threaten to cut off funding if it's not resolved in a case that they find meritorious. The advantage of going to DOJ is you get around the Prison Legal Reform Act, the PLRA. Under the PLRA, you cannot go into court for constitutional claims or for RLUIPA claims unless you exhaust all your administrative remedies. And in the prison context, that means grievances. So filling out a grievance. Depends on the prison, how much they'll allow people to help. They may let a chaplain help fill it out, but at least a chaplain can give some guidance on the religious aspects to a prisoner. And as I was mentioning to Adèle, and we've talked in preparation, one thing I found at DOJ, I saw a lot of these grievances as we brought cases, and they tend to go on and be rambling. And it's much to the prisoner's benefit if it can be concise, explain what's going on, explain why this is religiously important to them. What they have to do is come across as sincere, right? That this is not something just making up. It's not, they can be a recent convert. We had a case where someone was Catholic and was adopting the rule of St. Benedict. They were not a Benedictine monk, but they wanted to try to follow the rule of St. Benedict. And it was sincere. And there was a priest who verified that he was struggling to do this. And so he was able to get the right to a diet that conformed to the rule of St. Benedict. So it can be something like that that's recent, but it has to be sincere. And it has to be clear, and you have to show where's the burden. The document we put in the in the chat box, inmate religious beliefs and practices put out by the Office of Justice Program. Don't print it out automatically. It's 300 and some pages, but there are a good 20 pages in the middle that are about Catholicism, talks about, scapular. If you wear a scapular, you show it you can take the BOP and say, hey, this is what the BOP does. I'm not making this up. This is really a thing. Icons, blessed palms, all kinds of holy water, describes all these things, how they're used, and it can be a useful resource for prisons because, BOP is not perfect, but they've done a lot of work to try to accommodate people's religious exercise in prison, and can be a helpful resource. So I'm going to stop with that because I've got a lot of questions coming into the chat box, and so we should maybe start taking those.
Sure. And I want to make sure, John Hallinan wanted to know kind of more about people who are in the process of studying for a religion, if that would count toward being protected as a practice of religious belief. For example, they're studying RCIA. They're not officially Catholic yet, but are they still protected?
Yeah, it protects sincere religious belief. So just as you can follow the rule of St. Benedict, even if you're not a Benedictine monk, so you can have your religion be, I'm a seeker, and this is, I need my Bible because I'm wanting to become a Christian, and I read the Bible every day, and I don't belong to any religious group, but this is important to me. That's a religion under for legal purposes. I see Adèle's shaking her head, nodding her head. So yeah, okay.
Another area that's perhaps more subtle, it has to do with what most of us experience in this work as Catholic chaplains, is kind of an anti-Catholic bias. And that's certainly not unique to Catholicism. It exists. I think the Muslims and Native Americans have to contend with it, especially in parts of the country that we would call the Bible Belt, where there's just not as much tolerance toward people who don't agree with that particular flavor of Christianity. So, and for example, where I work, my Protestant colleague is a Seventh-day Adventist, and among their literature, it clearly states that the Pope is the Antichrist and the Catholic Church is the whore of Babylon. What do we have to kind of protect ourselves from our own peers, in a sense, who are proselytizing or delivering an anti-Catholic message? Or do we have any protection under the RLUIPA or any of the other things that you've described?
Father George, are you talking about prison officials, like chaplains who are?
It's actually, say, prison officials and staff chaplains, often who are hired by the prison, but it can be volunteers as well. But so it's not coming from the administration; it's coming from our religious peers in the systems.
That sounds like a lamentable situation, and I'm sorry that you have to deal with it.
No, but anything you do to educate them, I think this section, the 20-page section from the BOP guide, it might be helpful. Like, hey, these are the things that are important that we do that might be different from what you do. But yes, they are important.
Yeah, it comes down to sort of recognizing everyone's right to express their religious views, but what do you do when those religious views are directly critical of other people's religious views? And one example would be Chick publications, which are these, I believe, have been determined in some systems as hate literature because they're anti-Catholic, anti-Muslim, anti-everything, except this one person's fundamentalist views. Some prisons ban them, some don't. I don't know if they really have a leg to stand on. But I think for most of us who are involved in the work today, we encounter this constantly. So yeah, education is part of it, but I guess what I'm saying is there anything stronger than simply kind of trying to persuade people? Is there a way to say, this material is, not acceptable in some way?
I would hesitate to go down that road, Father George, because you're going to get that lobbed at you. Maybe not in the South, but in the Northeast or in the West, regarding basic church teachings. It's like you probably don't want to build out the law in that direction because you're going to hit the Bible base. So I would tend to view that, put on my kind of free speech lens for that, and say the counter speech is the best thing. If I'm being accused of being part of a church that supports all these terrible things, my own spirit of Christ is going to be the best counter narrative. But I understand that it is a very difficult circumstance that you're put in, especially when you're hearing things from staff chaplains that are really inflammatory in that way. I think that's very difficult, and I'm sorry that you're in that situation. I would hesitate. I would say, taking back and looking at the nationwide lens, I would want to be very careful about seeking to have religious speech that is regarded as critical of you banned in any way, because then anything that the Catholic Church says that is regarded as critical of other groups could then be banned in other systems. That same, the rule applied to you that helps you in Texas might not help you in California. That would be my comment on that.
But on the other hand, if somebody's trying to sort of muscle you out by saying, oh, yeah, we've got a Christian service run by the chaplain, we don't need a priest to come in and say mass. No, they can't do that. That's a burden. It's also discrimination, and you can win on either grounds.
Yeah, I agree with Adèle and Eric. The analysis changes if the hostile rhetoric or expression toward Catholicism is coming from a state actor, someone who is an employee of the prison system. That raises constitutional problems that could provide a remedy. But yeah, I fully agree that if it is simply other religious individuals in the prison system, or inmates or chaplains acting sort of in their private capacity, it would be a perilous sort of precedent to set to try to ban that speech.
Okay. Regarding you mentioned rosaries, and that's kind of a common thing, but the other big issue is sacramental wine. And so what would you recommend if we come to a situation where we come to the gate and the officer says, you're not allowed to bring wine in? Do we then refer to the BOP's guidelines, or is there some other avenue that we should follow to let the administrators know that this is actually required?
I think he may be frozen. I think.
Did you say Dan or Eric?
Sorry, Eric.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, so the question is, does it impose a substantial burden? And there actually was a case in the DC circuit where, unfortunately, there had been somebody on staff in the BOP who was, I believe, a Catholic nun who said, "Oh no, you really don't need the communion wine," and so they said, "Aha, you don't need it. Only the priest has to take it. You don't need to take it." And that created a problem, but then it was appealed, and they said, the BOP can't. On the one hand, you have this testimony, but then there's also other testimony from the other side saying no, that this was important. And they ended up winning as long as it was controlled, locked up in very small amount. So that's something that can be won, but I would say it would be kind of court by court. There might be courts that would say no, there's a compelling interest because of the risk of diversion. I mean, we've seen that with tobacco, as you mentioned, with Native Americans, that they're worried about it becoming contraband, and how much of it will get out there in the general population, and so forth. Though with Native Americans, it tends to be a very, very small amount of tobacco mixed with other weeds and things that make a scent but don't have any nicotine or anything like that.
So I would share information among the network about what works with the guard at the gate, because we're used to what works with the judge in the court, and those standards are a little different. I would say, probably one of my instincts, without giving specific legal advice to you in this situation, Father George, would be to say, well, the next prison over does this, or the warden allowed this until this year, or kind of pointing to, if I was talking to someone at a lower level, I would point to other examples from within the system that he or she is familiar with. And I just don't know, if you're standing there with a collar on and you're a priest and you're saying, I need this wine. I'm just not sure what document's going to persuade someone who's going to question you, Father, at that moment. But then I would, so thinking through, but this sounds like this is happening enough that it's worth thinking through a concrete strategy and maybe doing some iteration and problem solving and seeing what works. And again, we would love to continue to be in conversation with you about that and to provide support, or just to continue to dialogue with you about that, because it's a very important aspect of religious practice, and it should not be this hard. But one of the things we have found at Becket in this litigation is that a lot of things that should not be hard in prison are really, really hard in prison. In fact, we have some of my colleagues have written entire law review articles on how prisons game the system and to try and get out of doing things they know they need to do to accommodate inmates' religious practice. So I'm sorry it's hard. It shouldn't be hard. And let's keep talking about what the most, and sharing strategies for the most effective response. What have you found that has worked in that situation?
I think we're talking about certainly citing precedent, saying we've always done this until now you're changing it today. That's probably been the strongest argument. But then they can come back and say, well, I'm a new warden and this is my rule. So then it's a matter of trying to explain to him or her that this is part of our religious practice. I think what we're really looking at CPMC is for people who are encountering this on a regular basis, what's the best first step in terms of, like, is there a kind of a policy, a practice we could kind of come up with as on our website that people could go to and say, this is what the church teaches, this is what is being done in most states, and maybe specify which states. Therefore, we're saying that this is something that you can't just take away from us arbitrarily. So it's kind of organizing a go-to kind of resource for people. Alaska recently went through this. The statewide prohibition on alcohol in the prisons. So eventually they changed it, but it caused a lot of trouble. And this is not unique to Alaska or anywhere else. It's just it happened to a bishop a couple of weeks ago. He's turned away because of trying to bring wine in from mass. And there's also the argument that, well, an alcoholic priest is allowed to use grape juice, but that doesn't mean all priests can, and it requires permission for him to do that. So it's not as simple as simply substituting grape juice for wine. It really is, according to the rules, supposed to be alcoholic wine.
Yeah, and the bullying inherent to having a warden or a low-level prison official turn a Catholic bishop away at the door. It's hearing Karen say this. This is there. I applaud you for seeking to have a coordinated strategy and a clear game plan for addressing this.
Okay, well, I guess we could continue the conversation too. But is a coordinated strategy possible? I guess that's what I was saying. Like a one-size-fits-all sort of thing when it comes to mass wine.
Yeah, because it depends on the prison and why they're denying and what the specific dynamic is there.
I think the prison wine scenario is a good illustration of the rule or principle that Adèle mentioned earlier, which is that the religious exercise in question does not need to be compelled or required by the religious doctrine, but rather simply motivated by religious belief. So we are not claiming that a mass offered without communion wine would be somehow invalid. It is not compelled, but it is motivated. There's a similar case in a hospital, and I think Becket might have been involved in this, where they had a candle in the chapel, and the hospital, the federal authorities said, well, you need to make that a light bulb. It's still light. And someone had offered, someone had conceded in some other context that yes, maybe an electric candle would be okay. But that doesn't answer the question. That's not the end of the legal analysis.
Yeah, I think the candles are a great example. Also, after 30 years, I finally just gave up, and I use electric candles that look real. But I think there's an argument to say that precedent says that it should be a burning candle and in the chapel for mass. And I'm not sure if there's any specific rule that says it has to be, but that's one other way that I think sometimes you just get tired of fighting them and find a way to accommodate. But in a sense, what that feels like is you're constantly ceding ground to this sort of bureaucratic mindset that eventually will leave you with nothing. And that's sort of the fear.
Yeah, and that goes back to what you were talking about, Father George, about having when the chaplains that are on staff are coming from faith traditions that are very, very hostile to Catholicism to the Catholic Church as an institution. It's really hard to get those no's and not feel. And that's where going back to the nature of chaplaincy in dialogue with that chaplain may be important, and to reminding them in a respectful way that the role of the chaplain is not to advocate for their own religious beliefs. The role of the chaplain is to facilitate religious exercise on the part of everyone in the prison, and they have an obligation to work with you to facilitate religious expression and religious observance by all inmates. And really, actually, you are helping them in a tremendous way, because if you're not there providing these services and helping them, it's incumbent on them to make it happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
they really ought to be bending over backwards to work with you in the context, and they're stepping outside of the proper role of the chaplain if they are, even subtly blocking religious expression by those who they are, by their very role and the nature of their profession, are intended to preserve. Becket does work a lot with military chaplains as well. And the principle of the chaplaincy is kind of an odd one. Why is the government paying clergy to be on staff? It kind of feels un-American a little bit. But it has deep roots in our political and cultural tradition. And it comes back to that idea that where the government people are operating within an institution that has totalizing power over their lives, the government has an obligation to facilitate their religious expression, their ability to continue to live out their faith. Same principle in prison as in the military. So, I mean, to that extent, and that's again a longer dialogue point, but really reminding that chaplain in a respectful way of his or her role is facilitation, not blocking.
Yeah.
By the way, go ahead. I'm sorry, Father.
Well, I was going to say, I think it sort of reminds me of the issue around proselytization. And I know the military and the federal prison board haven't written down that they're not, no proselytation policy. In fact, the department here in California has that, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It happens constantly. And is there any way to enforce that, or to it's simply a matter of constantly reminding people that they're not supposed to do that?
Yeah, it sounds like something that can be so subjective that I think you're more effective on the education standpoint than if you complain and try to make a case of it, then someone says, "Oh, no, I'm answering questions as they arise," and it gets muddled. What I was going to draw attention to is not the inmate religious beliefs and practices of the 300-page document, but the 20-page document I put in about the program statement of the BOP actually has half a page on religious use of wine, saying it is permitted, and it talks about how to control it, the amount that can be allowed, and so forth. So that might be a useful. Not that everybody has to follow what the BOP does, but the courts do tend to look at what other practices are, and once you show that BOP can do it, then the burden's on a particular state to show why they can't match that, and they have to have some reasons for why they're different from BOP, other than just cost. They can't just say, "Oh, it is going to cost us, half an hour a week of time or whatever." That's not good enough.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you to have that in writing. We're coming up to the end of our time, and I know we could probably talk about this for hours, but what you've all described, talked about, has been very, very helpful, and to me fascinating, because it's something I've been living with for 30 years. So thank you so much for your time and your work on behalf of people trying to practice their faith around the country. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Dan, Eric, and Adèle for a wonderful presentation. And we'll see you next week on February 1st, God willing. Bye-bye.